You are listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello friends, my name is Silas Rose, and you are tuned into Awaken Relationship. With the recent release of ChatGPT-4 and all the online kerfuffle that followed, in terms of accolades and also dire warnings from people like Geoffrey Hinton, the so-called godfather of artificial intelligence, who recently quit his job from Google to be more outspoken about his concerns around the velocity and direction of AI, calling the rapid evolution of this technology a bigger threat, existentially, than the climate crisis. It's a bold statement, and a sentiment shared by others, including Elon Musk, who are concerned about our information ecosystem being completely overwhelmed by disinformation and deep fakes. So it beckons the question, friends, how do we know what's true in the digital age? Without shared truths, our consensual reality, dare I say our civilization, starts to get a bit wobbly. It's a confusing time, so I wanted to invite back a favorite on Awaken Relationship, Susan Gillis Chapman, Buddhist author and teacher, to have a conversation about the search for truth and meaning in a post-truth world. Here we discuss the truth as a felt experience, achieved through discipline, personal inquiry, and contemplative practices like shamatha and vipassana meditation. We also discuss the notion of toxic certainty and how to create safe spaces for dialogue that restore a sense of consensual reality and shared truths. Stay tuned. So Susan, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Silas. It's really great to be back here with you.
Yeah. And so it's really been a while, I think almost over a year, which is kind of hard to believe. And you've been busy. I know that you recently secured a new book deal. So I'm wondering what you could share about that.
Well, I just heard back from Shambhala Publications that they have selected a title for my book, which I think is kind of interesting. It's going to be called "Which Way is Up?"
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so it's a title that's both a question and a invitation, you could say. So I'm happy with that. And my book is, I believe we've talked about it before, the topic is really looking at the experience of groundlessness that occurs when something unexpected happens. And I used my cancer journal as an example, but it could be any of the different things that cause what we feel is normal to flip upside down.
Yeah, so, and then you're kind of drawing on traditional teachings from the Buddhist canon around the Bardo with that.
Yes. So I've been trained in contemplative psychology, where we apply these Buddhist teachings that are often associated with the after-death experience, the Bardo, and apply them to intervals of groundlessness that occur in everyday life. So, in contemplative psychology, at least the approach that I've been taking is that these are opportunities for transformation, where we can really have an opportunity to interrupt what we thought of as normal. And even though there's fear and groundlessness associated with that, we can have an opportunity to see something we hadn't seen before about, who we are, about, just kind of letting our reference points fall apart and taking a fresh look. So, sometimes we experience these as traumatic, and, I realize it's slightly oversimplified, but I feel that, for me anyway, the experience of trauma has been when those episodes happened without the support of loving kindness, both externally from my friends and people around me, and also internally, like not knowing how to bring self-compassion to those experiences. But when we do meet them with acceptance and loving kindness, we can hold steady with the fear and learn something new.
Well, one of the reasons I really love being in conversation with you is, well, when we kind of share the same path, for sure, within Shambhala, and we can kind of bop back and forth between a sense of personal path and then thinking about our path in relationship to the kind of evolution and development of society. And I really feel that we are in this kind of strange place post-pandemic, post-COVID, that we're really kind of in a cultural bardo, which I think some have kind of referred to as a post-truth reality. Or how do you relate to it?
Well, I think because my cancer journey occurred alongside the COVID pandemic, I tend to think of that period as the actual bardo, when life as we knew it came to an end, and we had no idea where we were going, and the so-called post-pandemic, to me, is an opportunity to see the two ways that we reestablish normal at the end of a bardo. And one is the kind of transformational option, you could say, is that we give birth to a new normal that has confidence in the not knowing. And, the discoveries, even a simple discovery that, many people made about working at home as opposed to working in the office, even though that meant they might be on the screen more, but still they reconnected with family, they reconnected with home environment. So there was a change there. The flip side is what happens when you go through that bardo of the pandemic without confidence or support for the not knowing, for that groundlessness, and how people can be very easily persuaded to cling to what I call sort of a life raft of toxic certainty. So it's not really a confidence at all. It's a fake kind of certainty that's based on, opinions and tribalism. And I think we see both of those happening right now. We see, groups of people who learned a lot from the bardo around being more trusting in each other, trusting in, and also aware of our interdependence, how important it is to be aware that there are supply chains that support us that we have to be aware of. And then there's also this other phenomena of this, maybe you're alluding to as the post-truth, where there are, you fill in the gap of not knowing with a altered reality, altered facts, as it were, alternative facts.
Yeah, it's like there's a solidification process that happens in the vacuum. And so I really feel like this conversation is kind of focused on that. I want to make sure we're kind of on the same page in that regard. We're really talking about this notion of truth. So,
wondering what do we mean by truth? What is reality?
Yeah, essentially, it's a pretty big topic.
It sure is. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess I can just speak for myself. I had a rather unusual background. I mean, it's not completely unique, but I was educated in a Catholic contemplative school or contemplative convent. Unlike a lot of, people's experiences in Catholic education, this one actually encouraged curiosity about what is true instead of indoctrination. And so in the school I went to, we actually studied logic, we studied syllogisms, we studied a contemplative spirituality where you investigate what you start off with, what you're told, and you use that as a springboard into finding out for yourself whether you believe it or not. So, I attribute that to the mentors that I had who were really wonderful. And so I guess I learned early on that there's both a trusting in the wisdom of what you have. You can sort of test the quality of what other people know and what they offer to you. But ultimately, you have to look really deeply within yourself. And there's methods for doing that. Like you can use logic. But, this kind of spiritual path led to Buddhism, which also had the same kind of invitation to truth test for yourself and find within yourself the way of knowing that is reliable. And, in the Buddhist teachings, it's interesting that the part of our mind, the part of our awareness that we turn to with this kind of curiosity is open space. It's sometimes referred to as the great mother, the prajnaparamita, that we have this insight, but the only way we can access that insight is by leaping from what we know into what we don't know. And that's the very space that we have to learn how to swim in. And if we don't, then if we're afraid of that space, then we can very easily grab on to an opinion, especially an opinion that makes us feel secure as part of a tribe. And what we do, if we do that, is we let go of the curiosity and we start replacing curiosity with this kind of false certainty.
So Buddhism is really considered a non-theistic tradition. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that means. And also, often we speak about relative and absolute truth, and how does that shape your understanding?
Yeah, I think Buddhism is often, sometimes what I hear the way, the media or other kind of expressions go is that there's, people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God, and people who don't believe in God are atheists, and sort of put into a category of kind of people without a spiritual path. And what I think is often overlooked is that the whole Buddhist tradition over 2,500 years is a tradition where, the teachings point to the fact that the human mind has great depth and great potential for complete enlightenment. And so that we don't need to rely on external, an external God, that the capacity for enlightenment is within ourselves. On the other hand, there's tremendous devotion and gratitude to the Buddha and to all of the, human beings who have made that discovery on their own. So I actually did find that the link for me, the bridge from a Christian tradition to a Buddhist tradition was very easy, because my Christian mentor described God, the Trinity, as, God the Father was the energy of creation, which in the Buddhist tradition, it would be what we call the Dharmakaya, the energy of open space, the potential of open space to create or to be the source of all experience. And then God the Son being the the truth of love, the truth of kindness and love and gentleness and compassion and the willingness to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of others. And in the Buddhist tradition, that would be the Nirmanakaya. So it actually paralleled really well for me. And then in the Christian tradition I was taught, the Holy Spirit was the energy that communicated between the two. And in the Buddhist tradition, that would be the Sambhogakaya, which is kind of how relative reality precipitates, you could say, from the dimension of complete openness into everyday palpable experience. So that I just wanted to mention that there is a very profound way of understanding in many spiritual traditions that maybe they're framed as theistic, but in fact there's a link, because sometimes we call it mysticism, but it's not about denying the truth of those that power that often people associate with, in my tradition, it was God is love, but it's more locating that within the human experience. That is what I call, that's what the non-theistic tradition of Buddhism is.
So was there a contemplative aspect to your early training?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. So we would go into retreat and we would reflect, and we did the what's now called the Lectio Divina practice, where you take a phrase or two from a spiritual reading and you deeply contemplate and allow something to arise from within you. It was very compatible. It was almost, very much the same as what I would do now. I just wanted to also add that, studying logic, and I know a lot of people maybe in the past studied logic in relationship to debate, which is a very helpful way of challenging our belief systems in a non-aggressive way, that, we can use logic to actually prove that a position is illogical. And that for me, the dissolution of the idea of God occurred one time when I was a teenager. I was just literally sitting in the forest, and at one point, I was sitting and contemplating, and I realized that the notion of God as being perfect, this notion of perfection, couldn't possibly exclude imperfection. And it was just a flash of insight, like how could perfection ever exclude imperfection? And it was like suddenly the whole notion of God disappeared, like in a flash, because I suddenly saw that everything had that, perfection and imperfection was the nature of everything. So it was logic. I was sitting there being logical, but the logic took me to the edge of what I often give the example of the diving board. You study, you practice, you test your truth. It's like climbing a ladder, and then you contemplate and you walk to the edge of the diving board. But you have to leap into the space of not knowing, and then that's where the insight arises. And then you might find yourself floating or swimming in a new reality.
Drowning.
Or drowning, that's true. Yeah.
Well, it just occurs to me that in some sense that's kind of what's happening is people are making that leap, but they're not bringing a discipline to it.
Yeah, well, the discipline always has a bit of a, negative ring to it. But I like to think of it as discipleship, that you're apprenticing with someone whose wisdom you trust. And so everything is what are you hitching your wagon to, as it were, like when I had that insight about, perfection and imperfection couldn't be separate, I didn't want to leave it there. I wanted to find a teacher who could help me understand how to live that way. What does that mean? And discipleship is when you take everything you know to the degree that you can, and you find people who have that same understanding, and then you see where they go with it, and you trust. You trust them, and then you test that out further. So I think what's happening right now, the lack of discipleship, is that we're not hitching our wagons necessarily. I mean, some of us are and some of us are not, because I don't want to be overly generalizing, but the danger right now is that the kind of loneliness of the pandemic and the fear that came up from the interruption of what we know, and also that background fear that here's a disease that can kill without, for a long time we had no sense of remedy, and suddenly, no matter what your age is, you're realizing you're going to die, or could die, and will die eventually. And so all of those come together like a perfect storm, and then we're not going to be hitching our wagon to the, to somebody who has the highest wisdom at that point. We might just want an escape route, whatever that escape offers itself to be. And so, you can jump onto a movement to use hatred, or to use any kind of toxic certainty, us against them, as a way of trying to, manage the fear and the groundlessness and anxiety. So I think it is a lack of knowing what a path is, not having a path. And in order to have a path, you have to have someone who's already kind of laid the foundations.
And that's the challenge, I think, right now, is that in this situation of information anarchy, there really is kind of an absence of what one might call moral authority, or effective gatekeepers of knowledge, and that people are essentially left to their own devices to figure out what is true, and then we add social media to the mix, or Telegram or other messaging apps where there's literally millions of self-proclaimed experts professing the truth. It gets really confusing.
Yeah. And, I think having an authentic lineage, or an authentic sense of path and direction, requires having really big long-term vision, not short-term, and that's part of the problem. That there's karma, there's cause and effect, and that you see this in the climate crisis, or you see this in the United States with the gun violence crisis, that there is a huge, immediate, highly dangerous, threatening situation, and yet there's no, it's like we're running around in circles, just dealing with immediate political, reactions, instead of looking at the long-term effect. So, spirituality, I think, in general, is it's different than religion. It's looking at the deepest possible, looking deeply inward, but also expanding as far as you can outward. In the Buddhist path, the practices are first of all, having a lot of compassion and intelligence for your own personal experience, but then, and you asked earlier about relative, relative reality is never denigrated. But at the same time, having, discovering that we are part of something much, much bigger and not overvaluating the self at the expense of the larger picture. So there is an investment both in widening the scope and caring about other people, and also going further into the long-term consequences of our decisions today.
Bring it back down to the relative. I think we are all guilty on some level of falling into some degree of toxic certainty. And that can mean, regards to politics or how we deal with our spouse. How do we, on a personal level, interrupt that?
Yeah, well, I think maybe it's harsh to say toxic certainty, but we could say what Trungpa Rinpoche described as background anxiety, that there's this fear, like the closer you look at your own experience, the more you can't pin down a solid ground and a solid territory to who I am. And for intimate relationships, whether it's a spouse or our close circle of friends or our pet, it comes down to the fact that, the toxic certainty or the what we generate from the background anxiety is this belief that we know who they are and that they're part of our territory. And therefore we can, they become part of a realm of hope and fear, or, I like this about you, I don't like that, or even a control pattern, punishing for when you make me unhappy. And so we're all in recovery from these patterns, and the recovery is interrupted, I think, by the very simple human experience of pausing to listen to another person, whether they're your intimate partner or a stranger or somebody at work. The moment that you really, truly set aside your own agenda and listen deeply to another person, what you're doing is essentially the practice of what we call in Buddhism Tonglen. You're exchanging your own self-interest and opening yourself to whatever that person is offering. And so that interruption is really huge in terms of interrupting the kind of mindless domino effect, you could say, of just one pattern of self-interest repeating after another. And we have to let go of who we think people are and let them tell us who they are, not just in words, but in being willing to be present with the kind of mystery of that human being and that relationship.
So if I was to recap this kind of journey that you described, from the contemplative Buddhist perspective, it's really about essentially kind of letting go, progressively opening the space. And out of that comes some kind of experience or a direct experience of the truth, as opposed to something that might be born of fixed logic. I'm wondering if it's actually even possible to arrive at any sort of sense of certainty about what truth is, or if even that's a goal.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Silas. Thank you. Yeah, I think that one of the things I love the most about my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, my first Buddhist teacher, is the way that he integrated this very heady approach, that we could think of as very heady, the logic and the exploring what is the nature of truth. And he just dropped you down into your heart. And, so he reframed it as, this space is the tenderness of our heart. And to me, that's the most accurate way of, you could say, truth testing, because If we're locked in a toxic certainty, or if we're locked into a logical debate alone and there's no heart, then it gets quite dangerous. It gets brittle. It gets frozen. But as long as there's heart and there's love and there's kindness and there's caring, not only for ourselves, but for the other person or other people, then that's a barometer for what is true. And I think, even though, again, it's not testable by logic, the confidence that we can have in that kind of truth is felt in an undeniable way. And, so you experience that, for instance, when I was a volunteer for hospice. No matter what, I was in a hospice where there were 16 rooms in the facility, and you go into each room and there is a completely unique human being there. There was one time when there was a very well-known politician in a very wealthy person in one room, and 2 or 3 rooms down the hall was a guy who just got let out of prison to come to the hospice to die. And, when you're with people when they die, they can have their stories that can trigger all kinds of reactions in you, like, I like this person, I don't like that, I agree with this person, I don't agree with that. But what it all boils down to is how it feels to be with this human being at this time in their life and the vulnerability that they have. And it just, it's true, it's possible to try to shut it down, but the feeling that happens in that space is a feeling of love, of kind of looking at the fear of death, and letting that go in order to be fully present with this experience of this other person. So, from that point of view, I feel like there is a way of having confidence, and it's the confidence of trusting in the heart. And yet, we don't want the heart alone, like emotions. This is not the same as talking about trusting our emotions. There's something deeper than that. And that is what the space is. It's this tender heart of sadness, tender heart of joy, tender heart of being present and realizing that there's no barrier between ourself and the other person.
That's a wonderful place to end. Susan, thank you so much for sharing with us your truth. I'm wondering if you could just let us know how people can find out more about you and your work.
Well, I am slowly rebuilding my website, but I think maybe stay tuned. The book won't be out until next year. But I think that exploring your own truth and your own heart, and looking deeper into spirituality as a way of finding our way through these very difficult times, and doing whatever we can to engage in conversation and relationship with other people rather than forming opinions about groups of people and, where they stand. I think all of that is the work I'm trying to engage in.
Well, we'll keep talking, and until next time, be well.
Thanks, Silas. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks so much for tuning into this conversation. If you want to learn more about Susan's work, head over to susangillischapman.com. I'll also post some notes and transcripts on my website, awakenrelationship.com. If you found this episode interesting and helpful, I'd really appreciate if you took a moment and left me a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps me to grow the show. If you have any feedback, you can send me a note on Instagram, LinkedIn, and I recently joined Substack, which apparently is the place to be for content creators. So please subscribe. So until next time, friends, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.